Lucky Luciano's men put guns on Bumpy Johnson. What Bumpy did next made the mob boss stand down Bumpy Johnson, the untold legend in Cosa Nostra. Bumpy Johnson's coat brushed the wet Harlem sidewalk as whispers of approaching footsteps echoed from the alley. Guns appeared, menacing and close, each aimed with expectation. Yet he didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. The rain-slicked streets of Harlem whispered under Bumpy Johnson's polished shoes. The neon glow of a corner diner flickered, reflecting off puddles like broken glass. He moved with a rhythm the city itself seemed to recognize. Each step measured, each glance calculated. The hum of late-night chatter, the shuffle of a distant delivery truck, even the faint squeak of a rat's clawed foot against cracked pavement, all held a pattern only he could read. Somewhere down the block, shadows lengthened. Figures detached themselves from doorways, lingering in alley corners. Men who belonged to Luciano's crew were already in position, unseen but intent. They had come with guns, with expectation, with a belief that a pause was weakness and a man like Bumpy could be forced into error. He felt it before he saw it, the shift in the air, the subtle tightening of the city's rhythm around him. The whispers of the block grew louder, carried in the wind, or maybe imagined, but instinct screamed the truth. Danger was near. Bumpy didn't rush. He didn't tighten his grip on the revolver hidden beneath his coat. Instead, he let the streets speak, letting the quiet announce him. Every step drew the eye of a nearby mother carrying her child, of a corner boy leaning against a fire escape, of a rival watching for shadows. They all froze, just as he did, as if the city itself had stopped to wait. And then they emerged. The guns, the men, the expectation of violence, all visible in the dim glow of streetlights. But Bumpy's calm didn't falter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He simply acknowledged the presence of threat, allowing the weight of his authority to settle over the street like a slow, heavy fog. Time bent for a heartbeat. Every man, every footstep, every heartbeat in Harlem seemed to slow. The trap had been set, but Bumpy Johnson never moved like prey. The night held its breath. Bumpy Johnson stood a few feet from the corner where the first shadowy figure had appeared, his coat collar turned up, hat low over his eyes. The guns were pointed, steady, deliberate, but the city around him reacted before any trigger could be pulled. Harlem had learned to recognize the pause that meant power, the quiet that could crush a man without lifting a fist. Mothers held children tighter in doorways. Street boys leaned against the lampposts, their eyes wide, measuring the invisible lines of authority. Shopkeepers peeked through grime-streaked windows, hands frozen above registers, knowing instinctively that this was no ordinary confrontation. Even the distant rumble of the subway seemed to soften, as if the city itself respected the weight of what was about to unfold. Bumpy's eyes scanned, but his body remained relaxed. No sudden movements betrayed him. No words challenged the men who had drawn weapons. He didn't need to speak. His presence carried more weight than any pistol. The men of Luciano's crew shifted slightly, uneasy, their own confidence fraying under the invisible pressure. Each second stretched, the tension palpable. Harlem watched. A corner boy, too young to understand loyalty, but old enough to recognize authority, tilted his head and whispered, "That's Bumpy." It wasn't a warning. It wasn't fear. It was acknowledgement of a principle older than any gun in the hands of a mobster. Power came from restraint, from knowing when to act, and when silence carried the final verdict. Bumpy's hand brushed the edge of his coat, just enough to remind the street he was armed, without need for threat. A slight nod to the nearest man in a doorway, the subtle shifting of weight from one foot to the other, and the message was delivered. The guns wavered. The men glanced at each other, realizing the expected panic had not arrived. Their threat, meticulously prepared, felt suddenly insignificant. Somewhere in the distance, a mother's lullaby drifted from an open window. A child's yawn punctuated the night. Yet the unspoken command held sway. No shots rang out. No blood was spilled. The street, which had waited silently, understood. Harlem had recognized its own king, And in that recognition, a quiet obedience took root, heavier than any fear. Bumpy Johnson didn't move yet. He let the pause linger, letting every man holding a gun feel the futility of his intent. The night watched, the city recorded, and in that moment, authority was absolute, earned, undeniable, unbroken. The men of Luciano's crew were not accustomed to hesitation. Power in their world was measured in immediacy, fists that struck without thought, guns that answered every doubt. But Bumpy Johnson did not respond the way they expected. His pause was deliberate, measured, and in it lay a force they could not reckon with. Inside a darkened alley just off the corner, the taller of the mobsters leaned against the brick wall, pistol still aimed, fingers tightening involuntarily. His partner shifted nervously, eyes flicking from the weapon to Bumpy's motionless figure, searching for a weakness. They had studied him, assumed they understood him, but the man before them defied every expectation. No trembling, no panique. Just an unyielding calm that filled the space more completely than their guns ever could. Bumpy's eyes swept the street without motion. He noted the distant shapes of his own men, silent shadows who respected the rhythm he set. Every step he might take, every subtle gesture, was calculated to reinforce authority without aggression. He let the city's heartbeat align with his own, slow, controlled, unbroken. One of the mobsters whispered, low and sharp, "You think he's soft?" He stops for nothing. What's he waiting for? The question, meant to provoke, hung uselessly in the night. Bumpy's presence alone answered, in his measured silence. In a way he allowed the tension to stretch without snapping. The men began to feel it. Control did not always roar. Sometimes control whispered, and the whisper carried the weight of inevitability. From the far side of the block, a lamplight illuminated the sharp angles of faces lined with fear and calculation. A young street hustler, watching from the shadows, gripped his own coat tighter, recognizing the lesson unfolding. Power was not brute force. It was observation, patience, understanding the value of every moment before action. The mobsters' hands wavered. Their plan, executed countless times elsewhere, unraveled slowly under the unspoken authority Bumpy projected. Every instinct that demanded aggression, their world's currency, was met by absence. No retaliation, no panique, just deliberate presence. Bumpy shifted slightly, and in that imperceptible movement, the lesson deepened. He could have ended it with a single pull, a single command. But instead, he allowed the night to speak for him. Every whispered threat, every lingering glance, every shallow breath in the alley reinforced what Harlem already knew. The man who controlled the pause controlled the outcome. The city itself seemed to bend to his will. A cat slinked from a doorway. A paper fluttered across the cracked pavement, unnoticed yet significant. Even the men of the mob felt it, their carefully laid plans suspended under the weight of something larger than any weapon, inevitability. By the time Bumpy moved again, it was slow, deliberate, measured. Each step carried authority. Each gaze reminded the men who could bend the night to their will, and who could not. In silence, without firing a shot, he had won. The street held its breath. The mob realized the lesson too late. Bumpy Johnson did not need to prove strength through violence. He proved it through control, through understanding, through an unshakable presence that reshaped the hierarchy of fear and respect in Harlem. Morning light crept over Harlem, weak and gray, but the tension from the night before had not yet dissipated. Bumpy Johnson moved through the streets with the same measured authority he always carried, coat collar turned up, hat low over his eyes, every step deliberate. The vendors were setting up their carts. The children chased one another along cracked sidewalks, and yet the block felt the weight of expectation. Something had shifted. Something had been tested. From the corner, a group of rival men, smirks sharp, voices loud, stepped into the street. Their intent was clear, to provoke, to remind the neighborhood that the old ways were theirs to command. One man, tall and brash, swaggered forward, hands swinging, voice dripping with challenge. Thought you were tough, Bumpy? Scared of the streets now. The words were meant to draw fire, to break calm with insult. In any other man, they might have worked. But Bumpy did not flinch. He stopped mid-step, eyes calm, scanning their movements as if reading a script they had not written. Time slowed around him. Every gesture they made was exaggerated in its futility against his stillness. The mobsters expected chaos, for Bumpy to reach beneath his coat, for the streets to erupt. Instead, he measured them, not with fists, not with threats, but with presence. His shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, gaze steady. He allowed silence to stretch, a bridge too heavy for their bravado to cross. The street itself seemed to pause, mid-breath, acknowledging who truly held power. "You can walk," he said at last, voice low, measure controlled. Not a plea, not a threat, truth. The words carried the weight of inevitability, more dangerous than any weapon they brandished. The rival crew faltered. Laughter turned thin, nervous, as they realized the lesson unfolding before them. Respect did not have to be demanded. It could be commanded. Bumpy Johnson did not need to prove his dominance with violence. His restraint, deliberate and absolute, carved authority into the morning air. Onlookers, hidden in doorways and peering from windows, absorbed the lesson in real time. Every vendor paused mid-task. Every child froze mid-step, and the neighborhood understood. The line had been crossed, but the response would not be chaos. Power was exercised, not in reaction, but in deliberate judgment. Even the tall man, who had sought to provoke, shifted uneasily, recognizing that the street had already spoken. The arrogance that had carried him forward now bowed to something heavier than muscle or menace. Control was not in the hands of the loudest, the quickest, the most violent. Control belonged to the man who could wait, who could measure, who could choose when action was necessary and when it was not. Bumpy continued down the block after the rivals had retreated, the street resuming its rhythm behind him. But the memory lingered. Every eye that had witnessed the exchange understood that authority, wielded quietly and decisively, could command obedience without a shot fired. Respect had been reinforced, subtly, indelibly, and the weight of Bumpy Johnson's presence left an invisible mark on every corner, every storefront, every passerby. By the time the morning fully broke, Harlem had absorbed the unspoken law. Public disrespect might be attempted, but Bumpy Johnson's calm domination ensured it carried consequences no one could ignore. Violence was optional, restraint eternal. Night fell over Harlem like a curtain, thick and heavy, carrying the echoes of the day's quiet lessons. Bumpy Johnson walked with measured steps, coat brushing the cracked sidewalks, hat pulled low over eyes that missed nothing. Word of the morning's confrontation had traveled fast, through whispers in storefronts, along alleyways, across stoops. His authority was no longer questioned. It had been observed, documented by every pair of eyes that dared to follow. But the men from the mob, the ones who had dared to test him, were not yet finished. They had assembled in a narrow alley, guns hidden beneath overcoats, eyes sharp, hands itching for provocation. They expected retaliation, expected chaos to erupt. They underestimated the weight of silence. Bumpy entered the alley slowly, deliberately. Every movement was precise, controlled. His gaze swept over the shadows, reading the tension as if it were ink on a page. The men shifted uneasily. They knew power when they felt it, but this was more than power. It was inevitability. One of the mobsters stepped forward, voice low but sharp. "You should have stayed quiet, Bumpy." A gun glinted beneath his coat. It might have been a threat to any other man, but not to him. Bumpy stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. The street, the city, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. His presence alone became the weapon, more precise than a bullet, more enduring than force. The mobsters tried to force a reaction. They laughed, they shifted, they tightened grips on triggers. But the calm in Bumpy's stance, absolute, unyielding, began to fracture them. The bravado that had carried them here faltered. Every glance toward him carried hesitation. Every finger twitch betrayed uncertainty. Then, almost imperceptibly, Bumpy nodded. Not a command, not a warning, just a measurement. That single gesture was enough. The men lowered their weapons, shoulders dropping, eyes avoiding the intensity of his gaze. Respect, not fear, had won. They recognized the inevitable truth. Resistance was optional, submission was survival, and Bumpy Johnson's authority could not be contested by violence alone. He walked past them, each step deliberate as a sentence pronounced in court. The alleyway emptied behind him. No gunshot, no scream, no fight. Just presence, just control, just the undeniable weight of a man who had mastered the art of command without drawing a weapon. By the time he disappeared into the streets, Harlem had learned another lesson. True domination required neither chaos nor confrontation. It required observation, calculation, patience, and the quiet, inexorable assertion that some men simply cannot be moved. Power was not loud. Power was inevitable. Bumpy Johnson had proven it, once more, for every street and every eye that watched. Dawn crept over Harlem in pale streaks, painting the cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts with quiet light. The city stirred, but the echoes of the night lingered, soft, subtle, impossible to ignore. Bumpy Johnson moved through it all with the same deliberate pace, coat collar turned up, hat low, eyes observing every detail. Harlem had watched him, tested him, and now it remembered. The mobsters had returned to their own corners, their weapons stowed, their egos bruised but intact. They had learned restraint when faced with authority that could not be challenged by force. They would speak of this night in whispers, not out of fear of immediate reprisal, but from the recognition of power exercised without violence. On the street, life resumed. Children ran past, laughing, unaware of the tension that had once held the block hostage. Shopkeepers swept steps, adjusted awnings, and exchanged nods of acknowledgement. Everyone carried a silent story from the night before. Bumpy Johnson, calm and unyielding, had shifted the rhythm of Harlem. The mother and child, the spark of the night's events, had returned safely to their apartment. The street knew their lives had been spared not by threat or gunfire, but by the deliberate choice of one man. And in that choice, the neighborhood found reassurance. Life could be preserved, order could exist, even amid chaos, if guided by someone who understood the true weight of authority. Bumpy paused at a corner, listening to the distant hum of a train, the faint clatter of a vendor opening shop, the murmur of voices greeting the morning. He did not speak. He did not look back. His legacy was not proclaimed. It was observed, measured in every nod, every glance, every quiet acknowledgement of the balance he maintained. By nightfall, the story would be retold in hushed tones, not for sensationalism, but for truth. That power was not in drawing blood, but in choosing when to withhold it. That respect was not demanded, but earned, and that one man, calm and resolute, could shape a community's destiny without firing a single shot. Harlem remembered, and in remembering, it carried forward a lesson far older than fear. Authority grounded in patience, observation, and restraint endures longer than any empire built on violence.